do not believe that profit should come at the cost of people and planet.
Janine, it's lovely to see you today. We're talking to Janine Woodcock, professional coach, speaker, and author of The Power of Choices. How have you been, Janine?
I'm good, thank you, Paul. Good to see you.
Good. It's been a long time. So, Janine, we're going to talk a little bit about leadership today, and something that I know from my experience of working with you, and of course of what you do for a living, that it's something that many people come to talk to you about. But if we could just start with a little bit of background to you and your career, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I spent 25 years in the digital data and direct marketing world. So leading agencies here in New Zealand, worked in Switzerland for a bit as well. And in that, given my age, a lot of that digital stuff was all at the point where it was new. So over the course of my career, most of what I've done is help clients do something that's not been done before. Whether that be taking something from an old bricks and mortar model onto online, whether that be doing a CRM system for the first time. And then over that, because most of my roles were sort of client services, so it was very much that in between the client and the internal agency team, loved the people side of that. And my clients used to, and you'll probably remember some of these from our work together, my clients used to bring me in not just to help them on the marketing side of stuff. So we might have sold in a new initiative, but the people needed to make that initiative work. Mm-hmm. So they would often be saying, oh God, we've got these teams that just aren't working together. What can we do? So back in the day, if I go back kind of 20 years, I was probably making it up a bit on the hoof. And then as I got more interested in it, was doing a lot more reading, as I say, it's gone over decades now, about leadership, but psychology, teams and how they work together, etc. And then 10 years ago, 7 years ago, decided to do a qualification in executive coaching. So I did a postgraduate master's in that to really give me the tools, rather than telling people they should be doing. So from a kind of advisor perspective, tools to help people find what they needed in themselves. So that was a big switch. Yeah. And fell in love with that as a discipline. And then 5 years ago, left the agency that you and I were both at, and set up on my own, and I haven't looked back.
Fantastic. There's lots of people that have benefited from that experience that you bring. So in the introduction, I as we said, I kind of went through a list of things that you are renowned for: professional coach, speaking, authors. You run your own consultancy. You wear multiple hats. So tell me a little bit about how you find balancing all those things. How do you spend your time?
So it's interesting because as somebody who's very driven and in the agency world, was that person that was doing 60, 70 hours a week, year in, year out for a very long time. So that relationship with my drive, if you like, got me to the point back in 2012 where I made myself pretty unwell through that, and I was off work for 3 months, which at the time felt like forever. Yeah. And because my whole identity was wrapped up in that, I'm super efficient, I can get stuff done, I know what I'm doing. It was a real challenge. So coming out of that, and then having taken all of the psychology stuff I know or knew, and then applying the coaching piece, and then all the well-being stuff I was paying attention to during that time when I wasn't well, I've emerged from that with a very different relationship with my drive. So how I choose to use my time is very purposeful, because I understand what I need to thrive and flourish to sustain my success over the long time. So I've written a book about that, which we'll come to later. Mm-hmm. But in terms of how I choose to use my time, I also do pro bono work. So over and above what you've talked about, I'm a mentor with the Prince's Trust, and I'm also a business advisor with Set Squared, the incubator down in Park Bristol University. And I guess underlying the common thread through everything. Oh, and I'm a non-executive director with Business West, so there's lots going on. But I think the thing,
you just don't have enough to keep you busy, Jen.
I don't have children by choice, so that probably helps a lot. I think the thing that pulls it all together is wanting to create to society and the economy in a way that allows people and the planet to thrive. So yes, profit is important, but do not believe that profit should come at the cost of people and planet. So the work I do is helping individuals bring their best selves into environments so they can manage their own energy, their well-being. Great job for their company. And I work with leaders and managers for them to be able to make choices and be very conscious in how they lead, to get the best out of their people, which in turn will create the best company returns. And if that company is purposeful in terms of our society, then that's going to help long term. So that's kind of where everything fits together.
That's nice. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of business being a force for good. And I think that's why when we set up Sparro House, I guess the two driving principles that we keep coming back to is that idea around sustainability and working with purpose-driven brands, as well as well-being. And like you know, I somebody who I remember coming into the creative agency world as an account exec and going, there was a client services director on my first agency, a guy called Chris Freeland, who I looked at him and he's always set the benchmark for where I want to be. And I remember at that point going, that's where I'm going to be, and I'm going to keep going until I get there. And you know, there are times where those wheels it gets to a point, doesn't it, where those wheels can come off. And it's interesting that you talked about self-identity, because I think through this current crisis, a lot of the people that I've been speaking to, myself included at times, have lost a sense of that self-identity as to the person that you thought you were, because your roles have changed. You know, if you're working at home at the moment and you've got young kids and you're not used to being a teacher, a childminder, the housekeeper, you know, the primary housekeeper, and you've gone from being, I guess, the primary sort of salary earner into actually, you know, what we're doing at the moment is my wife is actually, you know, retained 6 days a week, and I'm the one that's actually starting a new business and doing that whilst trying to do all these other things at the same time. So that sense of self-identity is a really important measure in terms of people's well-being, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And there's something about that identity, because often it's a big word, identity, isn't it? And you know, all of the research, we go through various different development stages as adults. You know, that's well documented and researched in the world of psychology. And our identities do shift, but there's something about that's a bit easier to get hold of, which is knowing the things that we need as individuals to thrive and flourish. And it's different for everybody. And I think that in the work I do with individuals, whether they're leaders or not, so I work with teams as well, but you know, we bring our individual selves into work, and then when we're part of the team, our individuality affects how that team operates together. But as individuals, the more we can understand about where our drive comes from, I did a webinar yesterday with a group talking about that, which is good fun, where our drive comes from, understanding the things that we strive to be. So you talked about Chris Freeland, and there were obviously characteristics you saw in him that you admired, but we also get our drive from seeing things that we resist and we don't want to be like. So we'll all have had that shocking leader who did something, or manager who did something so beyond what you would see as being acceptable, that you would never treat anybody like that. So we have this sort of dual, what we're attracted by and what we repel in our drive, but then how we use our energy is really, really important. Because if you're really driven and you love your work, you often see your energy as just something to use up.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I know I've spoken to you about them before, but there's a wellbeing company that we work with as Sparro House called Juno. And it was when I was doing the research into setting up the company and thinking about our employee wellbeings, particularly because my staff are, the majority of them are not permanent members of the staff. They're experienced people who have chosen to come out of permanent employment because it works better for their personal lives, that I wanted to make sure that we still looked after those people. And it was only in doing that research that I really fully started to understand the things that cause, say, me anxiety or the stresses in my life are not necessarily the same things that will cause you those stresses. So just because I think, you know, trying to do a 60-hour week plus be present at home and get, you know, the type of sort of physical activities in that I know are so important to me, is that balancing act that causes me anxiety. To other people, that's not a stressor in any way. actually the stressor for them is that they love doing that sort of stuff. It's that they can't get the house cleaned. So actually just having somebody come in and clean the house takes away all of that anxiety, that stress and everything that's in their life, because the other stuff, working 60-hour weeks, that's actually something that they want and enjoy doing. That's no problem at all.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. And it's funny, and when you talking about Juno and you introduced me and I've looked at them, it looks fantastic because it's all about, oh, my little book, I'm going to do that.
There you go.
So that word choices, and the whole purpose of this book is, so it's got a bit of my story in there, it's got lots of stories of clients in there as well, but this idea of the choices we make in the moment and how we choose to re-energize, how we interact with people, all of that contributes to our own stress. So that's basically a workbook for you to come out with a little blueprint of your own set of choices to then, maybe use a platform like Juno to be able to access whatever it is you need. So it's great, that there's businesses starting up with that mindset that you've got, even though they're not full-time employees, you're offering that, offering that to them. It's lovely.
I think the obviously the focus on employee wellbeing is something that I've seen noticeably increase in terms of visibility on LinkedIn, online, in sort of marketing publications in particular. I think it's going to be interesting to see how, I guess, what I tend to call the traditional bricks and mortar type of business model, as that dynamic shifts to not being present all the time. How do those leaders start to recognize the changes that are needed in themselves in order to look after the needs of people who aren't necessarily there present all the time?
Yeah, and it's an interesting time, as you say, for leadership, because I think when this started, this pandemic, so 2 weeks before lockdown, and I was talking to clients, and it was aware that it was getting serious, and whereas they would have been leaders previously who were very driven by that bottom line, that growth piece, the shift, the humanity very much came to the fore at the beginning. So it was like, oh my God, we've got to worry about our people. So it was people first, humanity, compassion. And then it was very much like, okay, well, the government, great, they've come up with furlough, so those people will be okay. So then it was back to the business and brilliant pivoting. So there's been lots of adaptability and energy. So if you imagine 3 Venn circles, so you've got traditional leadership leading for growth and profit as one bubble. You've got businesses already wanting to be agile and adaptable because our world is changing all the time and people recognize that. And then there's a sort of bubble of well-being, whether that be people or planet. Now, as we're going through this, what I'm noticing now is that energy that was in, we need to look after people and the humanity, it's starting to push back up into the growth and the profit and the adaptability, and some of that leadership focus on the humanities being lost. So I think the task for all of us leaders now is really to be conscious in show up and lead those businesses moving through this.
Is it time for new leadership, do you think? Are we in danger of slipping back into or not making the most of, I mean, this is a terrible situation we're in, but it's also, I see it as an opportunity for change. And are we at risk of slipping back to what was?
I hope not. So the old leadership, if you like, the command and control. So as a leader, knowing, scenario planning, oh, well, if we do this, this and this, these are the outcomes. The big shift I'm really seeing now is that those leaders who are used to leading from that point of command, not necessarily really kind of cracking the whip, but from a very strong place of knowing, they are the leaders that are struggling most through this. So a lot of my work now is helping leaders recognize their own style. So recognize where they might be controlling, albeit with good intention, or protecting. So when you're operating from a point of protecting and control, you're not being free enough with the possibilities, and actually being able to collaborate more, trust more, relate to your workforce, have a really strong vision of where you're trying to go, have the systemic awareness of not only your business, but where your business fits in society. The task of leadership has got bigger and harder.
Do you think, you mentioned trust, do you think that typical command and control model stems from, I mean, as a business owner, you understand that nobody will think about your business as much as you do. You know, you you're thinking about it all the time. You know the numbers inside out all the time. You know if a client does X, that's going to impact over here, whatever it is. But you hire good people to work with you, right? And you know, if you take the Steve Jobs analogy of, you know, you hire people with the strengths that you don't necessarily have. Um, is that a trust issue?
Yes, it is, and we're seeing that play out in a real bad way now. So a lot of the kind of teams I'm working with, if I'm doing group virtual workshops, they're complaining they're literally on Zoom all the time, and if they're not on Zoom or they're on Slack, if they haven't got their little green thing showing available, they're not doing any work.
Yeah,
according to the powers that be. So that is about trust. And actually, if leaders, again, if we as leaders to being clearer about the outcomes that we want from our people, rather than virtualism, which I think is what we're seeing a bit of now, that's better, because people will be able to juggle, whether that's going off to do a bit of homeschooling or whatever it needs to be, being able to juggle their time appropriately, but still deliver the goods.
I think that's you might not agree with me, but one of the reasons why well, I think it's two reasons. One, I think if you've consciously made the choice to come out of permanent employment and go into the freelance or contract world, you have to have a degree of experience to be able to make it in that world, which is one of the reasons why a lot of the people on our Sparro network are all senior ex-agency consultants. And the other reason that people do that is because they want to be able to balance work and life. And if that means that, you know, some people are more productive between like 5 and 8 in the morning, and then they're going to take the kids to school, and then they're going to turn around and they're going to go to the gym for an hour, and then they might go have lunch, and they'll crack on again in the afternoon, and maybe again after the kids are in bed. That's output driven. But I do think that takes experience, and I think it takes a level of expertise to be able to work in that way. But that's what I've been calling true remote working.
Yeah,
you know, there is virtual presenteeism,
yes,
which is what you were talking about, which is we've got flexible working policies, and you can work from home, you can work remotely. But if that's between the hours of 9 and 5:30, in my eyes, that's not flexible working or remote working. That is not getting a right balance between the things that we have going on in our personal lives and being able to juggle and have the ability to make sure that you still deliver, that you don't let your teams down, and you're output driven. And if that means you start work at 7 o'clock in the evening and you are still ready for the meeting the next day, in my eyes, so be it.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't, but you know, that's where you start with trust. And then if people don't demonstrate that they can deliver on that, then the trust erodes.
Yeah.
You know, rather than the other way around, which I think is what virtual presenteeism, which is I don't trust that I'm paying you to work unless I can see that you're physically there.
Absolutely.
Doing so.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And that, you know, and yeah, leadership task now is how do you manage that, and noticing yourself as a leader if you are erring towards that, and then what that for your team. So it's really conscious leadership of being aware of your impact.
I think so, and that's something I think you know, having recently set up a business myself and looking at those leadership qualities that I need. I mean, you know, of course, I don't think I ever expected that 2 weeks after setting up a business, I would be going into the current lockdown situation. And I know people say that, you know, setting up a business during a time of recession is the best time to do it. I don't think a global pandemic is the best time to go and do it. But you know what, you know, the resilience that it teaches you, I think, and you know, I mean, we were always going to be set up to be remote working teams because I felt like the office had almost become an anchor. You know, the number of times you speak to somebody and go, well, when was the last time you saw a client outside of a project? And it just wasn't happening.
Yeah.
And so I think true remote working without an office gives you the ability to work where you're most effective. And for me, you know, as trying to be a leader of those sorts of teams, trust just has to be there. Like it absolutely has to. And that's why I was saying that, you know, I start with a position of trust, and if people don't demonstrate that I can do that, then obviously that, we probably won't be working for much longer. But I think that that term that you use of conscious leadership
Yeah.
is a really interesting one.
And it's the other thing. It's funny. I had a conversation with a client the other week because I'd spent probably the last 6 months working with the leadership team, and we'd done 4 workshops, I think, over about 8 months. And a lot of the challenge I bring to the leadership is the way that they're having conversations. So it's very much checking that the impact matches the intention of the conversation.
Mm.
And it was interesting. And the MD said to me about a month ago, he said, Janine, all this stuff you talk about, it's all psychology. He said, it's all the soft stuff, really, isn't it? And I had a moment and I kind of went, wow.
Oh, no.
Part of me did the self-criticism of, oh my God, I'm not positioning it correctly. But then actually I came back to some of the challenges in the organisation. And I said, so coming back to trust, I said, so your complaints of what's happening in the system, reasonably big organisation, over 100 people, is that people aren't having the conversations that they need to have. So underperformance is not being tackled when it happens, but all the conversations, all the stories are, that person's no good. And I said, so this soft stuff that you're calling soft allows you to have the important conversations which will make a difference to the business. But because when you're working with leaders, and this is all about how you have the conversation, it's hard work. Because you've got to move away from your default of, I'm just going to tell that person that they haven't done a very good job and tell them they're rubbish. It's like, well, what impact is that going to have if you do it in that way? So it's really interesting. So trust, starting with that. There's a lovely analogy that Brene Brown uses, which is a jar of marbles. And each marble represents a degree of trust. So if you've got 300 jars in a marble, you're starting with it full.
Yep.
And somebody might do something that takes a handful of marbles out. Now, as a leader, your job is to have the conversation, the difficult conversation about the behaviour that took out the marbles, and understand how to move it forward so that you can put those marbles back in and move ahead. Many leaders, managers do not have the skills to have those difficult conversations.
Do you think it's because a lot of, and I'm going to reference the creative industry at the moment rather than generalize businesses, but the conversations I have with a lot of people nowadays is I certainly notice that the level of training that we put into people has tailed off massively from when I remember I started. The structures within the teams are less laddered. You've got quite a lot of junior people because agencies are trying to maintain margins, and then you've got your senior people, and there's a really, really big gap in between that, where that day-to-day mentoring and training isn't being captured on an ongoing basis. And quite often the people that rise quickly through those ranks are people that actually are very good at doing the job, the tasks.
Yes.
They're either brilliant creative, and so they get to a point where they're a senior creative, and then they're a manager of a team by virtue of default. But they've never been coached or trained as to how to be a manager. How do we have negotiation skills training that you and I have gone through together, and how do you deal with conflict? Because I think most humans it's ingrained within us to kind of avoid conflict as much as possible. It's the nasty thing that don't really want to happen, rather than let's just have this conversation right now at the point at which this conflict is occurring, so that we can be more productive, we can be happier, and we can move forward. And I just don't think that investment in people and training happens anywhere near what it should do within organizations.
Totally agree. And you see, I do a lot of work in the pharmaceutical sector and in the education sector, and in both, but more recently in the pharmaceutical sector, for exactly that reason, where you've got people who are technically very, very capable, so scientists, who have been put in managerial positions, and it's been a disaster. But historically, the only way you've been able to progress is by being a manager and having people under you. So that has equaled promotion, etc. Mm-hmm. So what the pharmaceutical industry has been doing for the last few years is creating roles where you can be a genius, have nobody reporting into you, and they call those people significant contributors. And it's just quite an interesting, so it's a bit like the creative director. And again, I've worked with a few over the years who've been amazing, either copy or art, and they've come up as thought, right, next level is creative director, and they've hated it because they're not doing their craft. Yeah. But there's not been any other way to stay. So that idea of a sort of significant contributor, I think, is really interesting. because not everybody is drawn to developing and helping people.
No.
It's a, you know, it's a certain skill set.
And it's one of the sort of, when I was sort of researching and setting up the business, it's one of the core reasons why a lot of senior people are leaving, have left, or are leaving the creative industry, because they don't want to be sort of, you know, if you're a creative person, you don't want to be responsible for the financial growth of that particular department, or you don't want to be overseeing a team of 15 creatives and getting involved in surface level day to day and heavily involved in new business. You want to be being creative. You want to be creating things.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a lot of people are then leaving the industry and going out into the sort of freelance or gig economy, which is great for me. Because there's an abundance of them there, and they're absolutely brilliant. But I love the term significant contributor. That's a really interesting concept that I think, you know, there are people who are drawn to leadership, and there are others that are drawn to being brilliant at what they do.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. Okay, well, look, I've got one final question for you, because I've talked a little bit about, you know, what it's been like for me in terms of, you know, new leadership style, you know, setting up a business, going into lockdown. Do you mind me asking how the current crisis has impacted your own well-being?
So in terms of a well-being perspective, I think I'm very well equipped because of what I've been through before. So I am really tuned into what I need to nourish and thrive. And I have to, because I've lived through it, walk the talk of all the stuff that's in my book. So I drive everybody nuts. So I eat well, I exercise, I take time out. So among all of that stuff I've talked about that I do when I'm busy, I absolutely schedule in time to not be busy, although my brain is often going. What's been interesting is, given that I'm very clear on what my purpose is, what I've noticed from this is that I very much, I'm almost still in a bit of a stepping back and retreating. So my income's dropped significantly because, quite understandably, leaders haven't got the headspace to coached. It's like the last thing they need right now is somebody really challenging them on what their impact is, because they're doing the absolute best they can. I know that will shift. So as people start coming out, it's like, okay, this is different. How do I navigate and manage through this? So I'm sitting with this, how I can best serve. So I have been doing work with clients on this conscious leadership piece in a small way, but I feel like I'm stepping back and I'm waiting to be called forth again by the people I work with, but that's okay. And I've been doing an amazing accreditation with a company called Leadership Circle, which feels like it's all the stuff I've been doing over the last 25 years sort of come together in one thing. That's been really interesting.
Neat little bundle.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear. Janine, look, as always, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I think with the expertise that you've got, I could probably sit here and talk to you for another sort of hour and a half, but I promise I won't. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, and like you said, I'm sure that will pick back up again, because there are going to be so many leaders needing your support and guidance.
Thank you, Paul, and I wish you all the best with Sparro coming out of this. At the beginning of a pandemic come through. It's been lovely to chat and see you again.
Right, brilliant. Cheers, Janine. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.